In the bustling city of Westbrook, where the lights of skyscrapers pierced the night sky, there was an unspoken divide that cast a shadow over its streets. This was a city where racial tensions ran deep, and people of different backgrounds rarely crossed paths, except when they had to. In the midst of it all lived a young boy named Elijah Thompson. Elijah had grown up in Westbrook's South Side, a neighborhood where children were taught early on to be wary of the police. To them, the uniform wasn't a symbol of protection but of fear. Elijah's father, James, had experienced it firsthand, often stopped and questioned simply because of the color of his skin. But Elijah's mother, Grace, always told him, "Change doesn't come by running away, son. If you want to change something, you have to be in it." As a child, Elijah loved stories of heroes. He would watch movies about brave men and women in uniform who saved the day. But in his neighborhood, those heroes were only on TV. In real life, the police were the ones who turned a blind eye to the struggles of people like him, or worse, were the cause of their pain. One night, everything changed. Elijah was walking home from basketball practice when he witnessed a police officer, Officer Martinez, unfairly roughing up one of his friends, Jamal, for simply hanging out on the corner. Jamal wasn't doing anything wrong, just laughing with some other kids. Elijah watched in horror, feeling helpless. But instead of letting it crush him, it sparked something in him. That night, Elijah went home and told his parents, "I'm going to become a police officer." His father was stunned. "Are you crazy, boy? They don't want someone like you in their ranks," James said, shaking his head. But his mother simply smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "Maybe that's exactly why you should," she whispered. Years passed, and Elijah grew into a determined young man. He faced challenges most would have given up on, from teachers who doubted his potential to classmates who mocked his dreams. But he never wavered. He kept his focus, knowing that if he wanted to change the way his community was treated, he had to step up himself. After graduating from the police academy, Elijah was assigned to patrol the very neighborhood he had grown up in. His presence in a uniform drew mixed reactions. Some of his old friends turned their backs on him, calling him a traitor, while others looked at him with a glimmer of hope, wondering if he might be the change they desperately needed. On his first day on the job, Elijah was partnered with Officer Stevens, an older, gruff cop who had been on the force for over 20 years. Stevens was skeptical of having Elijah as his partner. "You're one of them, aren't you?" Stevens muttered under his breath. But Elijah kept his cool, determined to prove himself, not just to his partner, but to the entire city. One evening, while on patrol, they received a call about a robbery in progress at a local convenience store. When they arrived, they found a young black teenager, scared and unarmed, cornered by the store owner. The boy kept saying, "I didn't do anything." But Elijah could see the fear in his eyes. It was the same fear he had seen in Jamal's eyes years ago. Stevens reached for his handcuffs, ready to arrest the boy, but Elijah stepped in. "Wait," he said, putting his hand on Stevens' arm. Elijah knelt down, meeting the boy's eyes. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "T. Tyler," the boy stammered. "I swear I didn't take anything. I was just looking." Elijah believed him. He had seen that look too many times growing up. "All right, Tyler, let's figure this out," he said, taking him aside to hear his story. After a few minutes, it became clear that it was a misunderstanding. The store owner had assumed the worst simply because of the boy's skin color. Stevens was fuming. "Why did you let him go?" "We had him right there," he yelled once they were back in their patrol car. "Because he didn't do anything wrong," Elijah replied calmly. "We can't keep treating people like criminals just because of how they look. That's not justice." The incident became the talk of the precinct. Some officers were impressed by Elijah's approach, while others, like Stevens, remained critical. But Elijah didn't let it deter him. He continued to patrol his neighborhood with empathy and fairness, slowly building trust with the community. One day, Elijah received an anonymous letter at the precinct. It was from Tyler's mother. "Thank you for believing in my son," it read. "You may not realize it, but you're changing lives." As months turned into years, Elijah's reputation grew. He wasn't just a cop to the people of Southside, he was their protector, their ally. He organized community meetings, spoke at schools, and mentored kids who were on the edge of falling into the wrong path. Slowly, even Officer Stevens began to come around, seeing that maybe there was another way to police, a way that didn't involve fear and suspicion. One night, while driving home after a late shift, Elijah saw flashing lights in his rearview mirror. His heart sank, a familiar dread creeping in. Even as a police officer, he knew the fear that came with being stopped in his own neighborhood. But as the other officer approached his car, they recognized him. "Oh, Officer Thompson, it's you." "Sorry for the trouble," the officer said sheepishly. Elijah drove away, a bittersweet smile on his face. He knew the road ahead was still long, that there were still minds to change, but he also knew he was making a difference. He had turned the fear he grew up with into a force for good. And as he parked his car in front of his parents' house, Elijah looked up at the city he had once feared. Westbrook was still a divided place, but it was slowly changing, one person, one act of kindness at a time. And Elijah, the boy who had once been told he didn't belong, was now one of its heroes. Because sometimes, to change a broken system, you have to fight it from the inside. And Elijah was more than ready to keep fighting, knowing that with every step, he was paving the way for others like him to follow. The years rolled on, and Elijah's presence on the force began to ripple beyond his immediate community. He was no longer just an officer patrolling the streets of Southside, he had become a symbol of change, an emblem of what was possible when someone dared to stand up against the status quo. But with the recognition came a new set of challenges. One evening, while Elijah was off duty, he received a call that sent chills down his spine. It was from a young woman named Jasmine, a single mother he had once helped out of a tough situation. Her teenage son, Malik, had been taken into custody after a minor altercation with another student. The school, located in a predominantly white neighborhood, had immediately involved the police, and Malik was now facing charges that seemed far too severe for a simple schoolyard fight. Elijah knew he couldn't ignore the call. He rushed to the precinct where Malik was being held, only to find that his reputation as a community leader didn't hold much weight with the officers on duty. As he walked into the station, the officers at the front desk gave him cold, dismissive looks. "What are you doing here, Thompson?" Officer Haynes, a burly officer with a reputation for being tough on Southside kids, asked with a sneer. "I'm here to see Malik Johnson." "I heard he was brought in," Elijah replied calmly. "This is none of your business, Thompson." "Let the system do its job," Haynes said, crossing his arms. Elijah stood his ground. "The system's job is to protect, not to destroy futures over minor mistakes," he said, locking eyes with Haynes. "Let me speak to him." Reluctantly, Haynes relented. Elijah found Malik in a holding cell, his eyes red from tears. The boy looked up with a mixture of relief and fear when he saw Elijah. "They said I'm going to be expelled and charged," Malik whispered, his voice shaking. "I didn't even start the fight. I was just trying to defend myself." Elijah knelt down so that he was at eye level with the teenager. "I believe you," he said softly. "We'll get you out of here. But you need to stay calm, all right?" After pulling some strings and making a few calls, Elijah managed to convince the school and the precinct to drop the charges. But it wasn't lost on him that Malik's situation could have easily escalated if no one had intervened. Elijah couldn't help but think back to his own youth, to all the times he had felt helpless against a system that seemed stacked against him. That night, as he sat alone in his apartment, Elijah realized that it wasn't enough to just change minds on a person-to-person basis. The system itself needed reform. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. He needed to push for change at a higher level. Encouraged by the support of his community and the stories of those he had helped, Elijah decided to run for city council. His platform was simple but powerful: reform the police, invest in community-led programs, and ensure that all children, regardless of their background, had the same opportunities. His candidacy was met with fierce resistance from some members of the police force and city officials who were comfortable with the way things had always been. But Elijah's message resonated with the people of Westbrook. He had been one of them, walked in their shoes, and proven through his work on the force that he was committed to change. On election night, the results came in slowly, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. But when the final count was announced, Elijah had won by a landslide. The people of Westbrook had spoken. They were ready for a new kind of leadership, one that wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo. As Elijah took his oath of office, he looked out at the crowd gathered in front of City Hall. He saw faces of every color, every background, all united by hope for a better future. His parents stood in the front row, tears streaming down their faces, proud of the man their son had become. In his first act as a city councilman, Elijah introduced a bill aimed at reforming police training, focusing on de-escalation and community engagement. He also pushed for investments in after-school programs and job training for underprivileged neighborhoods like the one he grew up in. It wasn't an easy fight. There were powerful forces pushing back, but Elijah was no stranger to uphill battles. Months later, Elijah was sitting in his office when he received a visit from Officer Stevens, his former partner. The older man looked more worn than Elijah remembered, but there was something different in his eyes, a glimmer of respect that hadn't been there before. "I came to say I was wrong about you," Stevens admitted, shifting uncomfortably. "You're doing something good here, Thompson. It took me too long to see it." Elijah stood up and extended his hand. "It's never too late to change, Stevens," he said with a smile. They shook hands, and in that moment, it was as if the final barrier had been broken. Elijah knew his journey was far from over. The fight for justice and equality would never be easy, but he was prepared to face it head-on. Because if there was one thing he had learned, it was that change didn't come from standing on the sidelines. It came from diving into the thick of it, no matter how hard or messy it got. And so, with the support of his community and the fire of determination burning in his heart, Elijah set out to change not just Westbrook, but to inspire other cities to follow suit. The boy who had once dreamed of becoming a hero had grown into a man who was one, not because of a badge, but because of his unwavering belief in the power of justice, compassion, and love. The end.